Hello dear friends, welcome to my channel. In today's video I'm going to work on texture using watercolor, and particularly I'm going to work on this big black silky bow and another accessory that you could see now in the middle of the artwork, which is still empty, is the golden earring. What I'm not covering in this video is painting of blonde hair, because I already created separate tutorial, and if you would like to watch that tutorial you can click on the link that I'm sharing now on the right upper corner. Also, you can find it in the description under this video. My name is Irina K and I'm an artist and art educator, and let's start. I'm working wet and wet, and first I cover a bigger part of the bow with a lighter gray color, and then gradually add in some shades, starting with the outline of the shape. Now pay attention. Once I stop to continue to draw the line, the paint is kind of bleeding and creating the spot that I don't really want to have. So it's really important in this moment to first try to stop as less as possible to create a longer line with the brush, and then once the paint is bleeding, you still can correct it and continue to move that spot with the brush. You see that on original photo, bow is much darker, and I'm trying to add a little bit more contrast to demonstrate texture more, and even I will try to make the lightest part a little bit better visible than on a picture to emphasize more light reflection on the bow. The left side is quite wet now, and even if I will add intense and thicker paint, it still will spread a little too much than I want. So while I'm waiting that this part will get dry, I'm actually working just on the other side of the bow. I started to add some a little bit darker shades on the bow, so I'm adding a little less watery paint, a bit more concentrated. I'm creating second layer, even the paint is still wet, but I'm covering that part that I already covered. But because the surface was wet, so paint still spreading and becoming a little lighter, and also gray tones covered a little bit more than I wanted. So with a clean and a little bit dry brush, I'm trying to move paint to wash out some part of the darker gray to create light effects. In this case, lights and shades are helping to demonstrate the texture of the bow. One of the first things that I personally pay attention when I work on textures, I look if the object is absorbing the light or reflecting the light. And if it's reflecting the light, how contrast that light is. So in our case, we could see some reflections on a silky or satin fabric of the black bow. So it's not absorbing the light as we see reflections. And we also can see that the light gradually turning into the shade. It means I need to create smooth transitions between lights and shades. Meanwhile, I continue to make shades gradually darker, especially in the central part of the bow, on the sides of the bow. So that part that is not on the light side, I'm trying to make it gradually darker by adding less watery, more concentrated black paint. So I have to say that actually for this bow, for the whole bow, I'm using only one color, only black paint, and I'm adding different amount of water, making it lighter or darker to achieve different types of shades. Now I'm covering entire shape of the bow to see how big that black spot that it will take space on my artwork. And then I would like to work a little bit on the outline. I'm using smaller size of brush, but what is the most important that it's not just smaller, it has a very sharp tip and it's more comfortable for some small detalization or working on outline of the shape. One thing that makes this process now for me really difficult is that the bowl quite wet and I need to continue painting and pay attention that I'm not actually touching the wet surface with my hand, with one of my fingers. So I need to keep distance between the paper and my hand. And I continue to make darkest shades on the bowl even darker. Again, gradually, as I want to have more control over the painting. You might notice that at this moment, bowl already doesn't look so grayish. It's turning into a little bit darker, closer to the black shade as its an original image. I'm shaping a little bit right side of the bowl because I need to cut out some part of the bowl and I don't want it to just slightly touch the edge of the paper. So I moved a little bit outline on the right side. And I'm creating again a couple of washing out effects to emphasize light reflections. And you might notice I'm taking away a brush to clean it with the water to make it drier. And you also probably notice that I'm changed brush for the smallest size to creating this more specific light reflections. Meanwhile, left side of the bowl is getting dry and I'm focusing on working on that part that is still wet, the part on the bottom, adding a little bit of darker shades again, making it also darker, looking more like a black rather than dark gray. There are a couple of last things I would like to work on the black bow before I move to work on the golden earring. I'm checking the main shape of the bow now at the final stage and correcting some outlines where I need, and want to add still a couple of light reflections on the lower part of the bow. Before starting to work on the texture of golden earring, I would like to ask you guys to give a thumb up to this video if it was helpful for you. It will encourage me to create more artistic videos for you and to share more watercolor painting with you. And also, I would like to suggest you guys to subscribe to my channel if you're interested to get updates on the new videos. And now let's focus on texture of golden earring. So first of all, I would like you to think how you would recognize that the texture of the metal, which gold is the metal, and how would you recognize that it's a metal if you look on the picture? And one of the things probably you will notice that you will see a lot of reflections because metal is always reflecting lights and also reflecting shades or other objects that are nearby. So that's why you will have a lot of light reflections and dark reflections. And the second theme, working on golden or metallic texture, I want you to observe and think about if this texture looks so glossy with a lot of very bright and contrast reflections, or the surface is more matte and demonstrates some scratches, so there is not a huge contrast between lights and shadows. In this particular case, reflections are very contrast. There are some very bright white reflections and some very dark, very close to black reflections. I started to cover main part of the earring with ochre. I added a little bit of water and I'm keeping some parts, those light reflections, basically white. I just don't cover the paper at all and I'm gonna keep them white. There are plenty of variations of golden color existing. So once you draw in your round piece of jewelry, just take a look if it's closer to yellow or pink or greenish. In my case, it's a warmer color for the gold. and that's why I use mainly ochre. And then for the darker shades, I start to add some brownish and reddish shades to the color to depict this warmth. At this stage, I continue to work on a wet surface, adding darker shades, and it helps me to create smooth gradients. Some surface of the earring already got dry, and in this case, I can start to create more specific shades where I don't really need to have a lot of gradients, specifically those areas where I want to emphasize this high contrast between light and dark reflections. So in those parts, I don't need much of gradient, but I need to have slightly better visible border between light and dark reflection. Talking more about color and shades for the gold, you might notice also on my palette some visible pigments of blue. So I'm adding some amount of bluish purplish color, not that much, just making shade darker because I don't want to go too much in the brown color in the shades of the gold. Now I need to wait a little bit till urine will get dry. And meanwhile, I'm just switching to some other part of this portrait. So I decided that it's time to add a little bit shades around. And I noticed that I didn't work much on the ear. So it's also time for me to add a couple of details, some shades in there. Colors are quite close to what I was using, just adding a little bit of purple to make color not that yellowish for the skin as I used for the gold. And another thing, as I'm trying to create more contrast on the earring, yeah, as I mentioned before, to have light and dark reflections. But what also helps when you draw golden accessories, if you will create some shade around. So also for my portrait, it looks more natural that there is a shade behind the earring, under the ear and the bow itself. So I'm trying to make also that those areas slightly darker to create more contrast between earring itself and surrounding. Plus, I use also very similar darker shades that I used in the shade under the earring, and I'm using them also on the earring to create atmosphere that those objects are merged together, that they are not two parts from two different pictures. Now I can add more darker shades on the earring, and I also want to focus on adding different varieties of color and shapes for those shades. So you might notice that I make some shades slightly more transparent by adding tiny bit of water in that color that I'm using for shades. I'm using different directions for the brush strokes, and actually I'm pressing on the brush a little harder if I want to make brush stroke wider, or I use very tip of the brush making some shadows on the earring thinner or thicker. Although I'm not trying to make this earring 100% realistic and looking totally alike as the original, but I'm trying to add even more details that I have at this moment because I still see there is a space for more detalization. As well, I noticed that the shade behind the earring is still quite light, so I'm planning to add some more shades on that area, as well as working on accessories, adding the bow, which is quite contrast to the face and the hair, and urine is quite detailed. I also want to work not only making darker shades on the neck, which I'm adding gradually, covering first that area with more transparent color and then safely adding a little bit more darkness there so I can control how dark would be shade under the bow, and also to create it more gradually to avoid having some very visible edge between new shade that I'm adding. Now it's also a good moment to review the artwork that I started to create, and because portrait and face and hair were the most important part for me in this piece. Although I added accessories as it was an original image, I want to add more contrast to the rest of the artwork, not only focusing on the great contrast of the bow and earring again, but also to add a couple of darker details in the mouth, for example, to add some shades on the nose. And I'm missing a couple of shades near the eye area and eyebrow, also on the cheek, to create that feeling that it's a profile. I'm gradually adding some shades on the face, so you might notice that I do not focus on only one specific part to complete it, but as I already have foundation of the skin and the hair and accessories, so it's like a next layer, next level once I'm adding some more darker details and working on the contrast and actually understanding how detailed should be the artwork. I'm adding gentle shade on the cheek under the eye and working then a little bit on the edge because I don't want it to be very visible and create shade that has very specific edge, so I'm softening it. And I want to add also a slight shade under the hair, adding a little bit of contrast on the eye, on the upper eyelid, and on the nose bridge. You might notice how face still looks quite light comparing to accessories, so it's a good moment to think what is the most important in your artwork. And again, as I mentioned, that for me, face and hair were the main point. I decided to add even more contrast, especially around the eyes, and I'm trying to make them border again a little bit softer by working with clean and slightly wet brush, removing and moving some amount of paint on the slightly wet surface around that shade. And I'm using the same process for adding shade on the cheek and a little bit on the lips, so making the surface slightly wet and then adding very small amount of darker paint. Also, you might notice that I use very small size brush. It helps me to work on a smaller details, although tip of the brush is very sharp and really ideal for some tiny elements like this um, very dark shade that I work on now. But also if I use the whole length of bristles, I can cover a little bigger surface quite easily without changing the brush. Gradually I started to use very dark tones on the eye, and they match to the black bow. I truly love these last moments when I'm feeling that I'm very close to the end of the work, and I try to compare some parts of the piece that I was working on to add final detailization and contrast to make sure that artwork is balanced. And sometimes I know that for a lot of people it's a very difficult moment to decide if it's right time to stop or still want to add some more details, because in the same moment you don't want to overwork it and you still want to keep it fresh and alive. Since I added some more contrast in the face, especially on the eyes, so I'm adding also a little bit more contrast on the earring. And now when I'm working on the very final touch of my artwork, I want to thank you for staying with me till the end of this video. And I want to wish you guys a lot of inspiration in your drawing. Don't forget that you can share your artwork with me if you paint the same topics, portraits, and if you use the same references that I shared with you. And I want to wish you an artful day and see you in the next video. Bye.